Throughout the ages, the biblical reference to Son of Man has been a very perplexing yet interesting title for many. Though the term is used widely throughout the biblical text, there are certain times where the biblical text uses the title Son of Man specifically referring to Jesus. For example, God uses the title of Son of Man 93 times in reference to the prophet Ezekiel. Though the prophet Ezekiel was used mightily by God, we have no reason to suggest that Ezekiel was being called no more than a human or a man in a paraphrastic sense. We also know that Jesus Christ was called the Son of Man as well. This use of title was used concerning Jesus a total of 88 times, usually one of the more used titles throughout the New Testament writings. More than not, Jesus will call himself this title rather than others calling him this. The question that must be asked is, what does the title Son of Man mean? In John chapter 4 verse 2 it says, "By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God." In this verse, the author John is encouraging the believer to ensure that they are testing every spirit to ensure that the spirit or that person is of God. Due to an alarming level of false prophets, it was John's task to warn the believers to make sure that they did not fall into Gnostic beliefs, that is, rejecting the physical nature of Christ, namely his flesh. It's of importance that the believer understands that Christ did not just come in deity, but certainly in full flesh. His coming in flesh through the virgin birth of Mary, his mother, was needed for him to be able to atone for the sins of his people. Dr. Stephen J Willem, professor of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and author of God, the Son Incarnate, The Doctrine of Christ, states, quote, "As God progressively revealed himself through his covenants with Adam, Noah, Abraham, Israel, and then David, it became clear that God himself would have to act in order to redeem humanity and restore creation through the coming of his own kingdom. But the covenantal developments also revealed that a man, a son, the king, must redeem humanity through suffering, to then reign over restored creation as God's righteous vice-regent and faithful covenant partner. A man must come to represent God on earth. A man must live in covenant obedience to God. A man must bear the covenant curse on behalf of a disobedient humanity. And a man must rule with the character of God over the earth. As Dr. Willem so elegantly puts it, it must be man that will come to accomplish the goal of atonement and the redemption of creation. It was a God-man, Jesus, that would eventually come, following all those who were mere foreshadowings and allusions to the one, the Son of Man, Jesus Christ. The Son of Man title points to Jesus' full humanity. Without such, there would be no redemption, and the emphasis of the resurrection would be lost. One of the oldest heresies is what has been already mentioned, namely Gnosticism. Gnosticism is very attractive to many because its worldview attempts to remove the material and/or physical aspects of our bodies. Gnosticism would argue that the body was a source of evil. This evil was to be surpassed by any means. According to Gnostics, it's important to reach the purest emanations of pure disembodied wisdom. Another separate yet similar worldview is called Docetism. Docetists would argue that Christ appeared to be human, but didn't have real flesh and bones. He was in human image without human substance. The term Docetism first occurred in a letter by Bishop Cyprian of Antioch, where he rejected the notion of such heresies. Moreover, Docetism was categorically rejected and pronounced a heresy by the Council of Nicaea in 325. Additionally, virtually all Protestant denominations also reject Gnosticism and Docetism as a damnable heresy. As we can see, the rejection of Christ's full humanity was seen as no minor issue, but a very serious rejection that was met with fierce refutation from the church throughout history. The title Son of Man gives the understanding that Christ is fully man. The consistent and biblical Christian must embrace Christ's humanity, lest he or she falls into grave heresy. Concerning Christ, the title Son of Man also engaged his humility. The scriptures are replete with inferences of Christ being the second person of the Trinity, humbling himself in order to accomplish the will of the Father. For example, we read, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 through 8. The second person of the Trinity humbled himself in order to accomplish the atoning work of the cross. Though Jesus is worthy of all honor and glory and had all rights and privileges of being deity and could never be disqualified at being deity, he emptied himself, or the Greek word kenosis, which means self-emptying or self-renunciation. This emptying is not to be conflated to mean a removal of deity or a replacing of deity for humanity. It is to be understood of Jesus willfully and humbly submitting himself to the Father, even unto death. The Son of Man title not only is attributed to Christ because of his full humanity, but also his humility. The deity of Christ is of such importance that the Son of Man should be understood as a reference to Christ's deity. We see in many areas of scripture and where there are direct claims of deity by Jesus and where he uses the title Son of Man in reference to acts that only God himself would have the authority to claim or do. For example, we see in Matthew chapter 9, verse 6 that Jesus, using the title Son of Man, claims that he has authority to forgive sins. But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He then said to the paralytic, "Rise, pick up your bed, and go home." What's important to not miss is the reaction of the crowd that was watching Jesus heal the paralytic in Matthew chapter 9, verse 6. It says that the crowd was awestruck and glorified God, Matthew chapter 9, verse 8. The crowd was not awestruck merely by the miracle that took place, but also by the fact that Jesus has such authority. In other references, we notice Christ forgiving sin, and because of this, the religious leaders accuse Jesus of blasphemy because he, Jesus, is doing something only God alone can do. Read this in Mark chapter 2, verse 12. The clear implications of this is that Jesus, being the Son of Man, has full deity and authority that only God himself could and would be attributed of having during a time and context. The outrage of the religious leaders should be a clear indication for the reader to conclude that Christ is fully God. Another biblical reference that must be mentioned is Matthew chapter 26, verse 64, which states, Jesus said to him, "You have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." The verse is a foreshadowing and/or imagery captured in Psalms 110, verse 1, and Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. These two references are compiled to proclaim the eternal existence of Jesus Christ before Caiaphas and the religious leaders. Moreover, the Old Testament references exalts Christ as being the eternal one having divine wisdom to judge. The response of the high priest and the others in Matthew chapter 26 verses 65 through 66 should be remembered as well. After Jesus claims deity by referring to Psalms 110 verse 1 and Daniel chapter 7 verse 13 in the preceding verses, Matthew chapter 26 verse 65, the high priest tore his robe saying, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of a witness? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered, "He deserves death." The imagery that is encapsulated in Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 26 verse 26 and the response to such statement by the religious leaders should cause the reader to walk away with the understanding that the Son of Man title is a direct title of Christ's deity. In conclusion, it is clear that the title Son of Man has a variety of implications and clear conclusions if the reader allows an author's response to the biblical text, that is, if one allows the author's intended meaning to prevail. There should not be any confusion concerning the title Son of Man. As stated before, it's a title that Christ attributes to himself 88 times in the New Testament. More than any other title, the title encapsulates his humanity, his humility, and his deity. This is why the title Son of Man has great refutation power as it concerns those who reject the humanity, humility, and deity of Christ. This is how we should understand the title Son of Man.